Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for another weekly walk. Today is Wednesday, September 6th. Thank you for joining us. And today, if you're not already aware, it is Fashion Week, which is why today we will be talking about Central Park Fashion Week and all things fashion in Central Park. So thank you for joining me, Carla, on our walk today. All right, so as always, don't forget that you can use your Zoom tools along your toolbar to interact with us throughout our program today. You can use the chat feature to say hello and make any comments, perhaps respond to our poll also. But if you have any questions, please be sure to use our Q&A feature, and my colleagues Jose and Juan will be on the back end helping to answer any questions that you may have. And you can also turn on the closed captioning to see a transcript if you'd like. Now, as always, our mission here at the Central Park Conservancy is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of us all. And so I hope we can do that with you today. So you may be wondering, why are we talking about fashion? It looks like all of us tour guides are always wearing the same thing with our green leafy shirts, right? Well, this week, as I mentioned, this week is kicking off Fashion Week in New York. And New York Fashion Week is an event that is held in September and February of each year. And it's when designers are showing their fashion collections to buyers, to the press, and also to the public. And New York Fashion Week actually has a long history. It was started by a woman named Eleanor Lambert, and she first called it Press Week because the purpose was to show the press these different fashion collections. And she was the press director for the American Dress Institute. And her goal was to attract some attention away from the French fashion designers who are already well known. During World War II, when folks couldn't get to France because of the occupation by Germany. And so when no one was able to travel to France, they were able to bring more focus to fashions designed in America, and specifically in New York. So initially, Press Week, that precursor to Fashion Week, was held at the Plaza Hotel. But the event grew quite a bit over the years and started to spread out and have different venues all at once. And then in the 1990s, Fashion Week actually moved to Bryant Park. But there was a bit of a pushback from park goers, as some of you as passionate lovers of Central Park would understand. Those park goers to Bryant Park didn't want their park being taken over by Fashion Week and not be able to use their local park. And so Fashion Week moved to Lincoln Center for a time. And now, again, it's seen at a number of different venues. Here, for example, we're seeing a Michael Kors show that was held at Tavern on the Green. This was in 2021, and this was the very first fashion show after the pandemic. But we're going to take the opportunity of Fashion Week today to take a closer look at the role of fashion in the history of Central Park. And we'll also check out some of the fashions on display in the park as we take our walk. So we will start our walk here at West 67th Street. We're going to enter at West 67th Street, take a little walk past Tavern on the Green, make our way east along the south end of Sheep Meadow, and then head up the mall, which is sort of a runway in and of itself. We'll go past the Naumburg Bandshell and end, of course, at Angel of the Waters Fountain. So we start our walk entering here at West 67th Street, and this is one of the unnamed gates of Central Park that does not currently have a name. And as soon as we enter, we can see that the park is already dressed in its finest greens. And we can also see that right away we are right by the famous Tavern on the Green. And as I mentioned before, and we were seeing that photo of the models, Tavern on the Green was the location of a Michael Kors Fashion Week show just a couple of years ago in 2021. And this was the first live fashion show to be held after the pandemic. But we'll find that Central Park's history with fashion starts much further back than that. And we're going to sort of jump around the various decades of that fashion history throughout our walk together today. Now, of course, Tavern on the Green was first known for its wool pieces, worn, of course, by the sheep who slept here and were fed here. But once the sheep were sent packing and they were living in Prospect Park instead, this sheepfold was, of course, transformed into Tavern on the Green. And that restaurant has often been a place to see and be seen, where various celebrities can display their fashionable looks. And it's also been the site of a number of fashion shows used as fundraisers for a variety of causes. And as we make our way around the tavern, we notice that there is some accessorizing outside of the restaurant, as these gorgeous late summer wildflowers are sort of accessorizing the outside of Tavern on the Green. This is some lance-leafed coreopsis. And yellow seems like a perfect color to kind of carry you through the end of summer and into some different, more autumnal fall colors. And we'll make our way around outside of the restaurant here. And as we make our way down the path, we can appreciate blue, another classic hue for summer, in the form of this near cloudless blue summer sky, and also these kind of blue appearing towering skyscrapers. And as I was looking at those really super tall, super skinny skyscrapers along the southern edge of the park, they started to make me think of supermodels because of their height and their thinness. And now we are going to cross the drive to continue on our walk here. And as we do, we notice the fashions of folks who were in the park on a late summer day. Mostly they're wearing shorts and sneakers. But of course, when Central Park opened, that is not what you would see people wearing on the drives. Now, of course, the park opened originally in the winter, so of course they would have been wearing shorts and sneakers. But also, originally the drives of Central Park were created for folks to enjoy the park from their horse and carriage. And the drive was a place to show off your horse and carriage, as well as what you were wearing inside of your carriage. And back then, no one was wearing shorts or t-shirts. They were wearing their finest. Here is an illustration from 1869, giving us a sense of the fashionable turnouts in Central Park. In the 1860s, the carriage parade on Central Park's drives were a show, and they were enjoyed by the rich as well as more working class visitors to the park, at least as spectators. The working class were simply looking on and not really participating, unfortunately. And it was reported in the papers at the times that crowds loved to gather and watch wealthy New Yorkers ride in their carriages, and admire the fashions of the wealthy. But as always, the crowds also liked to be critical, because even today, who doesn't like to sit and people watch and make their own commentary about what people are wearing and doing? So they have a recording of an Upper East Side Irish nurse who expressed very strong disapproval when a lady drove by wearing a feathered bonnet and a dress with velvet panels and cascading fringes and flounces, because apparently she preferred those ladies who wore simple bonnets, apparently. So what were the fashions like in the beginning of Central Park? Well, the park first opened at the end of 1858. And by the 1860s, the fashion landscape was changing with advances in sewing machine technology as well as technology in dyes. The fashions of Paris were also all the rage here in New York City. During this time, women's skirts got about as large as they could possibly get, with the help of the cage crinoline, which meant you didn't have to wear quite as many petticoats to get really big volume of your skirts. But you can imagine this is a comedic photo of a very dramatic crinoline a woman would wear to make her skirt really especially large. And there were a number of frustrations and dangers involved with these apparati. But, the skirts were very large and they were also very long and full, which wasn't easy when you're making your way through a city like New York, which in many areas could get quite dirty. So there was even a special invention introduced by a Madame de Morist, who was a New York entrepreneur who built a fashion empire of stores and magazines and dress patterns. But she also invented a feature that allowed you, it was called the Imperial Dress Lifter, and it allowed you to discreetly lift the hem of your dress to avoid it touching the ground and getting dirty. Now, also at this time in the 1860s, men's fashions were relaxing into wider, more comfortable cuts. And we see here a dress that was designed by Elizabeth Keckley, and she was a woman fashion designer who was a Black woman who was previously enslaved and went on to design fashions for the wife of Abraham Lincoln. And perhaps this is as good a time as any for my colleagues to drop a link in the chat to some shows happening at New York museums around women fashion designers. But let's keep moving on our walk. Now that we've crossed the drive, we've come to Sheep Meadow. And of course, in the summer, Sheep Meadow may be as known for what folks are wearing as for what folks aren't wearing, because lots of folks are always sunbathing, of course, in Sheep Meadow in the summertime. But skipping ahead about 100 years in our fashion history, Sheep Meadow has a vibrant social cultural history, especially in the 60s and 70s, and that was quite a time for fashion. So here we see some fashionable looks that folks were wearing from the 1967 Easter Day be-in on Sheep Meadow. And in the New York Times, the crowds were described as wearing crowns of daffodils in their hair. They painted their foreheads blue and gold and rainbow. Women were known to show off their Easter bonnets. It was an Easter Day be-in after all. And youths also tied balloons to paisley ties. And one onlooker commented, "Look at those hats, look at those helmets, look at those bananas that people are wearing." Not sure exactly how you wear a banana, but even if you were wearing bananas out on Sheep Meadow today, we will not send the fashion police after you. But these are not the fashion police. These are park rangers, clearly wearing quite different outfits than the other folks on Sheep Meadow who are displaying that long tradition of not wearing a whole lot on Sheep Meadow, but hopefully they are wearing some sunscreen. You can also see the park ranger sporting a kind of fanny pack, which has become much more trendy once again in our current fashion looks. But looking back at today's park, some things never change, but then again, some things do change. For example, the trees are so much taller now in the park than they were in some of those photos. And here, as we're making our way past Sheep Meadow, we are appreciating some of our London plane trees growing here that provide shade even to those folks who aren't covering up much otherwise. And I was thinking as I looked at these trees that when I was a kid, I used to call these trees camo trees because I thought that their peeling bark pattern kind of looked like camouflage or camo pattern, which is interesting because upon further research, I found that camouflage in fashion using that camo pattern really came to be a big trend in the 1980s. And since I'm a child of the 1980s, it kind of makes sense that that was my visual interpretation of this bark pattern. But let's continue to make our way east along the path just south of Sheep Meadow. And we are noticing some fashionable visitors just ahead of us wearing much brighter colors who don't wish to blend into the scenery at all. And making your way through Central Park, you'll always see a variety of fashions, some of them more playful and some of them more practical. And this is a great time to find out what inspires you folks in your fashions in regards to Central Park. And so we're asking, what part of Central Park serves as your fashion inspiration? So are you inspired by the lake? You like smooth, calming blues and fabrics that flow? Or are you inspired by Bethesda Terrace? You like to wear as much ornamentation and decoration as you can? Or perhaps Sheep Meadow because you like to stick to sensible woolen knits? Or the Ramble because you like to wear natural fibers? Perhaps you're really into animal prints and you are more inspired by Central Park Zoo, or perhaps you're inspired by a whole other part of the park I hadn't thought of. Go ahead and let us know in the comments how Central Park inspires you fashion-wise. All right, so let's keep moving on our walk. Now, we are practically at the mall, just coming around the Olmsted flower bed now, and the 1,200-foot straight path in Central Park that we call the mall is almost like a runway or a catwalk in and of itself. So let's see what the models on that runway are wearing. And we come, of course, to our first model here, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare once said that the apparel oft proclaims the man. And it definitely looks like he is judging the apparel of those standing below him. But let's take a closer look at Shakespeare's apparel here. Now, here is a better shot of him, where we can really see some of the detailing of his outfit. Now, Shakespeare lived close to 300 years before the creation of Central Park, so we are seeing some much older fashion history here, some 16th century designs. Back then, fashions were known to be especially colorful and flamboyant, so it's likely that his outfit is sporting some very heavy brocade on his jacket, which would be called a doublet. And you'll also notice that his short little trousers here almost appear like they're slashed through. And this was a purposeful feature on this kind of garment so that the undergarment would actually show through. And we have to comment on his stockings as they definitely show off his shapely legs. Now, of course, those kinds of materials like brocade and velvet and things like that are not machine washable. So Shakespeare does have to get his outfits professionally cleaned, which is what we see happening here with some of our Central Park Conservancy preservation team helping to keep Shakespeare looking his best and all cleaned up just in time for Fashion Week. Now let's see how you folks were inspired by the park in your fashions. It looks like about 35% of you like blues and calming, flowing fabrics. Blue is definitely a very popular color in clothing. And lots of you are sticking to natural fibers, but not too many of you are into animal prints. I'm sorry to hear that. Not necessarily, fur or anything made out of animals. And lots of folks are into exercise gear and bike gear, which came up so much in my studies for this walk that I think it might have to be its own weekly walk about what folks wear for exercising and that history, because it is very interesting. But myself also, I tend to like to keep things pretty comfortable, but I also do like some ornamentation and some animal prints myself. All right, so let us keep moving. And also decked out and featuring a great deal of color and texture is the Olmsted flower bed here, perfectly in season with its refreshing greens and bold pinks and reds. But there are a number of models to check out on the mall, so let's keep moving. And of course, the mall has also always been a place to see and be seen, and it was a lot easier to see folks on the mall than on the drive because everyone was walking along the mall. You weren't trying to see wealthy New Yorkers hidden up in their carriages and see what outfits they were wearing. It was a little bit easier to check folks out walking next to you on the mall. And here are some women in the 1880s showing off their fashions and those of their children. This is about 20 years after the opening of the park, roughly. And you can see that skirts have gotten a little narrower, but they also involve a great deal of decoration. Often the fabric that was used on dresses was similar to that used for drapes and furniture, so they were probably quite heavy dresses. But rather than wearing crinolines, women were wearing bustles, and that tended to protrude off the back, because the silhouette for women was changing at this time. However, even with all of that, these children and ladies definitely seem to be having fun, regardless of the contraptions underneath their outfits. And here along the mall, we're seeing fashions maybe about 10 years later on the mall, possibly about the 1890s or so. And skirts seem to be hanging a little more naturally. Because this was a time when more women were a little more active, so they needed their outfits to allow for more movement, even bicycle riding perhaps. And you also see some bowler hats on the men. This was something that was coming into New York with many new immigrant groups to the city. And this is what folks are wearing today. Probably a little bit more, like many of you reported, looking for natural fibers and things that are a little bit more comfortable. But let's talk about our next model here, Robert Burns. Now, Robert Burns lived during the mid to late 18th century, about 100 years after Shakespeare, so menswear had changed a bit. He's sporting a quite loose, oversized coat, and it's most likely made of wool. And during this time, clothes would be made of all natural fibers and dyed with natural dyes. Wool and linen would have been readily available in his native Scotland. And at this time, men are most commonly wearing some version of a three-piece suit. And he's wearing a kind of cravat, probably made of linen. And this would be a precursor to the necktie. We also see Burns showing off his shapely calves, similar to Shakespeare, but he has kinds of socks pulled up to longer trousers that go over his knee, almost more like what would be called breeches or breeches. And just across the way, we have our other Scottish poet here, Walter Scott. Now, I know it may sound surprising to talk about these gentlemen in terms of fashion, but there's actually quite a bit to say about them. Here, first of all, Walter Scott is taking the oversized coat look to new lengths, as it were. But he was known to wear what was called an advocate's gown made of black alpaca. That's kind of like a judge's gown. And Scott lived just a little bit later, about 1771 to 1832. So he's advancing menswear by about 20 years or so. And he wrote a novel, Waverley, in 1814, that really set off a kind of rekindled or sort of new interest and passion for Scottish culture and introduced it in a different way to Britain and the royal family especially. And so as a result, there was a kind of fascination with Scottish culture. And soon the British were interested in all things Scottish. And that included an interest in tartan, or what we would call plaid. Now, previously, tartan had communicated intimate fighting, but by the 19th century, it was all the fashion rage in Britain. And if you've ever leafed through an LL Bean catalog, you're familiar with there being different kinds of patterns of tartan. And Walter Scott is responsible for the creation of that and starting the idea that different tartan or plaid patterns came from different clans. That was kind of his invention. Now, in terms of his outfit here, it is hard to tell whether he is wearing trousers or whether he is still wearing tights and breeches, because this sort of transitioned in the mid-19th century in menswear. But it's also possible that he is wearing a kilt, as that also was something that he made popular from Scottish culture. Now, we don't want to leave Fitzgreen Halleck out of our talk, but the biggest difference that we will notice about him is that he is most definitely wearing pants. But he was known to comment quite a bit on fashion in his writing. He also is known to sport a very different look, more of a layered look during the winter times in Central Park. Now, fashion can communicate quite a bit about its wearer, and there is a lot to say about our Women's Rights Pioneers Monument. So first, we start with Sojourner Truth. You'll notice that she is wearing a knit shawl, and this is linked to the knitting on her lap, which she was often seen with because this asserted her status as a free woman who had access and time to learn knitting. And then right to her side, we see Susan B. Anthony. And she is known for her accessory here, her alligator purse. And alligator as a material was really taking off at this time during her lifetime, but she didn't use this so much as a fashion statement. Most people didn't see her alligator purse as being fashionable, but rather more practical. It looked more like a doctor's satchel, and it was always stuffed with a variety of pamphlets that she was using to collect and share information. And we also notice the jewelry. She is wearing a pendant of Minerva, the Roman goddess of strategy and wisdom. And then we also see forgetting her Elizabeth Cady Stanton, sorry, her name had escaped me. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is also wearing a meaningful brooch with a sunflower that was an early symbol of the women's rights movement. And you would also find women wearing sunflowers as accessories to demonstrate their affinity for the movement. But we'll keep making our way down the mall as we wrap up our walk together today. And I couldn't help but notice a fashion shoot happening here on the bandshell, where the photographers were trying to capture the beautiful full length of this peachy golden silk dress, no crinolines underneath to give it any structure, unfortunately. And this was yet another really huge fashion show happening just west of the mall. They wouldn't tell me anything more about it, but you could see the clothing racks getting set up. And then we head to our most ornamented part of the park. Of course, when folks think of design in Central Park, they are most likely thinking of the intricate and ornate designs of the arcade and Bethesda Terrace. In fact, when you look up at the encaustic tile designs, they do kind of make you think of a really fancy high-end scarf pattern or something like that. And it may be kind of hard to compete with the looks of all the designs in the arcade, but these folks I saw getting a little fashion show in weren't afraid to try and compete with some of these looks. Even those fashions worn by these paintings that sport on the side of the arcade. But what Olmsted and Vaux are probably most well known for in terms of design are the views that they design, like these beautiful views that frame the angel. And speaking of animal prints, you can also see sometimes people on the terrace, not just sporting animal prints, but actual animals. It's not just snake skin, but an actual live snake that this woman is wearing as an accessory. Now, in fashion shows, they often give the end of the fashion show, they call it the closing, to kind of their prime biggest name model. And we are going to go ahead and give the closing to our most beautiful and most iconic Angel of the Waters and allow her to finish up our runway show on the mall today. So thank you for coming on this little walk through some fashion history of the park. And if it has taught me anything, it's that there is actually a very rich fashion history to the park that I hope to dive into again with all of you on a different time, perhaps Spring Fashion Week. But even if you missed Fashion Week, we have a number of super cute celebrities flying into New York City right now, not just this week, but over the coming weeks during fall migration season for birds. So you can check out the hottest trends in wing bars and eye rings with our warblers, thrushes, and flycatchers. And you can do that with the help of our tour guides on one of our birding basics tour that these are being offered throughout September. So definitely check those out. They are filling up quickly. And my colleagues will drop a link to that in the chat. But I want to thank you everyone again for joining me today on this weekly walk to talk about fashion in Central Park. We greatly appreciate your support of all of our programming. And until we see you again next week, thank you so much and be well. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.